So you mentioned something about sunlight. I don't know when that's coming. It's not coming right now, anyway. I must admit, for the past couple of weeks, I have been quite apprehensive about this event and thinking about what to say. Speculating on China's future is a fool's errand, okay? There are many people that try to do it, and not many people who do it very well. So the question is, how do we do this important task of thinking through and discussing China's rapid and unprecedented rise without falling back on tired clash of civilization tropes and things like that? I think perhaps the best way to understand the future of a global China is by looking at phenomena that are occurring within the country today, and then trying to look at the ways in which these phenomena are kind of interlinked with and connected to, and also parallel, similar phenomena around the world. This approach also allows us to counter the prevalent depiction of China as this monolithic unitary other that's an existential threat to the current liberal order. The reality is that what's happening in China is not something that's happening in isolation, and China is not acting in isolation, but it is actually very closely connected to developments around the world. So today I have opted to discuss three interconnected developments in China, things that I think many of you will have probably at least heard about, and these are the emergence of China's social credit system, the rapid development of surveillance technology within China, and the mass detention of minority groups in re-education camps in Xinjiang in the west of China. So I'll begin with the social credit system, which has received kind of breathless and widespread coverage in Western news media, much of it very misleading. For those of you who watch Black Mirror, usually the social credit system is compared to an episode of Black Mirror. To put it simply, what social credit really is the Chinese government's attempt to, and I quote, provide the trustworthy with benefits and discipline the untrustworthy so that integrity becomes a widespread social value. They seek to accomplish this by creating a credit rating system that draws not only on economic activity, but a range of different social activities that can be quantified and measured through big data analysis. At the moment, there's no unified system as we usually see depicted in the media, but rather many pilot programs run by local governments and big tech companies in China, using different criteria for measurement. The main thing that people are really worried about is that online social activity, including what you say on social media or who you even interact with on social media, will be used to determine a score, creating a situation where political speech and activity can be quite effectively curtailed. The emerging social credit systems, though, do not only rely on data harvested from online activity. It's also linked into the rapid development of other kinds of data-producing surveillance technologies, particularly facial recognition. The Chinese government has invested heavily in their network of advanced CCTV cameras and have developed drones and other means of tracking and identifying people across the country. Some of you will probably have seen the multiple news stories about criminal suspects being arrested in crowded places such as music concerts, thanks to facial recognition software. These types of surveillance technologies are being tested across the country, but especially in Xinjiang, the western region of China, as part of the development of an all-encompassing surveillance state targeting minority Muslim populations. Xinjiang as a whole has become a securitized police state with checkpoints, surveillance, and the tragic mass detention of between 1 and 2 million people in re-education camps. It's in Xinjiang where we see the grim logical conclusion of the development of digital technologies for social control. So, considering the speed, scale, and intensity with which China's surveillance and mass detention state has been erected, it's not really surprising that it has been perceived as some sort of abnormality, something outside of global norms, and ultimately an existential threat to the the world order that we are accustomed to at the moment. Indeed, much commentary in Western media frames China as maliciously and disruptive in its actions, bending the market system and new technologies, both of which are supposed to, according to what we've been told over the past couple decades, have liberating qualities, instead disrupting them and turning them towards evil ends. In this telling, the digital dystopian future is originating in China, with the rest of the world being in danger of following China's lead, either willingly as part of a general authoritarian shift or through coercion from an increasingly assertive Chinese party state. And while it's certainly true that China is involved actively in exporting parts of its new digital surveillance state, this version of events fails to really accurately depict the global linkages and the ways in which Chinese cases parallel similar developments elsewhere in the world. If we turn back to social credit, for instance, rather than simply perceiving it as peak Orwellianism that could only emerge in a totalitarian state like China, it's perhaps more useful to check it for any traces of ourselves in these ambitions to create a trustworthy society. While the main focus of social credit has been on the social, we should probably not ignore the credit element. Social credit is actually based on regular credit rating systems. It just seeks to assess trustworthiness by drawing on more data and aims to apply this determination to a much wider range of activities. But at its core, the fundamental logics are not really that much different. The parallels between social credit and other forms of rating trustworthiness can be clearly seen, for instance, in microcredit programs that are widely promoted and pushed by Western development agencies, many of which are increasingly relying on big data, behavioral economics, to ostensibly make sure that credit is allocated to those who are in the best position to repay. We should also look at ourselves when it comes to the development of surveillance technology in China. Chinese surveillance tech shows boast the attendance of many Western multinationals, all hoping to get a piece of the lucrative surveillance state pie. Moreover, Chinese surveillance technology companies often rely on components produced in the West. It has also recently come to light that researchers from prestigious Western universities such as Duke, MIT, Yale, and others are involved in research partnerships producing technology used in Chinese surveillance. At the same time, there are obvious parallels with the big tech, police, border security, and military nexus that exists elsewhere in the world. As in China, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has utilized social media to track suspects. Meanwhile, companies like Palantir, established by the co-founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, are working with police forces and ICE to produce predictive policing technologies aimed at profiling high-risk suspects before they even commit a crime. Moreover, Amazon is tapped to become the cloud computing provider for the Pentagon. So, in short, in China and the world over, governments are harnessing big data with the potential for severely repressive outcomes. Finally, the rapid expansion of the surveillance state and mass detention regime in Xinjiang is intellectually inspired by many strategies that were developed in the war on terror, particularly the emphasis on prevention, which has resulted in the incarceration of huge numbers of people based on their imagined potential to become radicalized. The global counterterrorism industry also has direct links with what's happening in Xinjiang. For instance, Eric Prince, the founder of the mercenary company Blackwater, now runs a private security firm called Frontier Services Group, which has opened a training center in Xinjiang. And Western investment companies, including one co-founded by our friend Hunter Biden, have invested in surveillance technologies that are being used in Xinjiang today. There is also more and more evidence emerging that the Xinjiang camps are providing forced labor for Chinese companies, some of which supply Western markets. More broadly, it's really impossible not to see the parallels with other border detention regimes emerging in the US, Australia, and Fortress Europe. So, to conclude, around the world we're seeing some very disturbing trends. A general authoritarian shift, the development of repressive technologies, and the normalization of mass detention regimes. China is a big part of this, but these trends are not solely emanating from China. Rather, what is happening in China is one dramatic manifestation of a more general global set of phenomena. As such, of course, we need to carefully document and watch and analyze what's happening in China. But we need to do it in a way that allows us to link up these events with things that are happening elsewhere. We should not see China as the root of all the problems that we are perceiving in the world today. Rather, in order to challenge and resist the emerging global digital dystopia that I've kind of laid out here before us, requires a concerted effort working in solidarity the world over.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That's very interesting. Don't look at China thinking about Orwell or as if China being something completely different. Look at China and look at what we are doing. What do you think about that image? That what is happening in China is also somehow happening in many other places of the world.
I don't think that's I think that's perfectly logical in the sense that I think that some of these traditional ways of trying to compartmentalize what's happening in the world, if they were ever valid, are no longer valid. Exactly because this globalism isn't just us selling stuff to other places. It's techniques coming back refined and going back again. And of course this is also part of there's money in it, which by definition also makes it extra dynamic.
Yes, I was reflecting on the roots of this system, and I started with the communist one, and then I came to the Confucian one. This is in line with Confucian values, I would say, in some way.
The social credit system, you mean?
But yeah. But what do you say about the root system? Because if we find it all over the world, well, the Confucian one is a bit problematic. So from where is the idea of this kind of system?
Social credit.
Yeah.
Capitalism, I would say, is the root of this kind of system. I mean, the Chinese government likes to draw on Confucianism or communism or different sets of ideological ways of doing things when it wants to. People outside of China do the same. You know, it's easy to say, oh, well, China's like this because, Confucianism. I mean, I think the way that I look at social credit is it's an extension of a credit system, actually, and that's capitalism.
So, yeah.
I mean, just to follow up on that, there is a very interesting book called Weapons of Math Destruction, written by a Harvard mathematician who is looking at all of these algorithms that we use in all of our systems, and not even the people putting them together can really tell you how they work. And they're used for predictive policing in the US for the last 10 years, long before anything necessarily came up in China.
Yeah.
I'm hearing many of you speaking about authoritarian regimes, strong men. Will there ever be anything such as liberal democracy or in China?
It certainly doesn't look so at the moment. I think this is another trap that we kind of get sucked into quite frequently when we look at China is it's either this or it's something that we need to define for what China is going to become. And it really, I think it kind of bootstraps, it puts us in a box that doesn't allow us to really think outside of that and think more productively about what's happening in China today. So, I don't know. One thing I'm definitely not going to do is make a prediction about whether or not China will have liberal democracy or whether or not the Communist Party will fall. You're not going to trick me into doing that.
I didn't think you would answer, but it's interesting that you remind us that if we constantly keep saying, when will they ever have democracy? When will they ever be like us? Then you have a problem. Yeah. Yina.
I think it was so interesting to hear about the parallels between the so-called prevention of terrorism and the intertwined big data usage. How do you think that affects the willingness to condemn what China is doing in Xinjiang globally?
I mean, I think that's a big part of it, but it's only one industry that is entangled in China at the moment, right? I mean, we've just seen the big story over the last week that the NBA is also, can't say anything against China. And I mean, I think you have a lot of companies that are heavily invested in the Chinese market, and you have a lot of countries that are heavily invested in the Chinese market. So, I mean, I think this is one aspect, but it's just one aspect of a much bigger thing, which is that China is a huge part of the global economy and a huge part of the global capitalist system, right? So, I mean, when we're thinking about why aren't companies taking a stand or why aren't countries taking a stand, we should probably ask ourselves, why is the system set up in a certain way that companies wouldn't take a stand, right? Because it's interesting to see, die-hard libertarian capitalists in the US decry how the NBA is not standing up for what is ethical and moral when the NBA is just doing what makes business sense.
Maria.
Yeah, thank you. I was also very fascinated with this, the comparisons between, for instance, the fight against terrorism. And I was thinking, if the argument is that we learn from each other and the technology is going here and there, and as you were pointing out, maybe it's equally bad in a lot of other places, US, maybe Europe, maybe Russia, wherever. I still think there's one big difference now, which I'm not sure is going to be there in the future. And the difference now between China and all the others is that in the others, they don't admit to doing it. To some extent, it's against the law. To some extent, the government might very well be breaking the law, but they are not proud of it. They're not talking about it unless they have to, unless they get revealed. But in China, the government has turned it into something that they try to frame in a very positive way and are very open about it. And do you think that the sort of seeing how it's been working in China might actually now spread over other two? Will other governments also learn from that? How you actually exploit it and talk about it? You don't have to be ashamed about it, you can be happy about it. As a government, not as a person, I assume.
That's a really great point. I mean, I don't know if other governments will learn from it, but I think what you've just mentioned is one of the great reasons that China is an amazing place to study about everywhere. Because the Chinese government will say very explicitly, kind of in ideological terms, why it's doing what it's doing. And people get very taken aback by that. It's like, oh my gosh, how can they say something like this? And then if you think about it for a little bit, oh, wait a second, social credit, wait a second, that's how a credit system works. So, I mean, in this way, China's an amazing place to look at. You really learn a lot about yourself.
You've been living in China for how many years?
I lived in China for 5 years, did my master's degree there, and then I went to the UK for PhD and go back yearly, usually.
What's the best thing about living in China as a foreigner?
It's just, I don't think you can pick one thing. China's an amazing place. It's a really wonderful place to live. Yeah, I don't know, I should probably say the food, but I think there's a lot of interesting things about living in China.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, yeah, I just ask because there are so many worrying things that you hear all the time, but I imagine that if you look at it from a different angle, you will see a whole different story.
Well, there's worrying things happening everywhere, but I mean, at the same time, people just kind of live their lives too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you very much, Nicolas Loubere, for your